If you've ever driven across the American Midwest, you know the feeling. Mile after mile of golden corn and green soybeans stretching endlessly beneath an impossibly wide sky. Red barns dot the landscape, small towns appear and disappear like islands in a sea of grain. This is Iowa, a name that has become synonymous with the very concept of America's heartland. But these fertile plains weren't always blanketed in crops. Just 2 centuries ago, this was a wild prairie, home to towering grasses, vast herds of bison, and Native American nations who had called this land home for thousands of years. The transformation of Iowa from untamed prairie to agricultural powerhouse is one of the most remarkable stories of American expansion, a tale of ambition, hardship, innovation, and the relentless human drive to build something lasting from the raw earth. Today, we're going to journey back through time to understand how this happened. We'll meet the native peoples who first shaped this land, the explorers who charted its rivers, and the waves of pioneers who staked everything on a dream of prosperity in the tall grass prairie. This is the story of Iowa, and in many ways, it's the story of America itself. To understand Iowa's story, we first need to understand its geography, because in many ways, the land itself determined Iowa's destiny. Iowa sits in a unique position in North America, bordered by the Mississippi River to the east and the Missouri River to the west. It occupies a geographic sweet spot that would prove irresistible to settlers. But the land we see today is dramatically different from what existed just 15,000 years ago. During the last ice age, massive glaciers crept across what would become Iowa, grinding rock into fine particles and depositing rich sediments as they retreated. These glaciers were nature's greatest landscapers, flattening the terrain and leaving behind some of the most fertile soil on Earth. When the ice finally melted around 10,000 years ago, it revealed a gently rolling landscape covered in thick, dark topsoil, a gift from the glaciers that would one day make Iowa the envy of farmers worldwide. But first came the prairie. For thousands of years after the glaciers retreated, Iowa was dominated by tallgrass prairie, an ecosystem so vast and so alien to European eyes that early explorers struggled to describe it. The grasses here grew incredibly tall, sometimes reaching heights of 8 to 10 feet. Big bluestem, Indian grass, and switchgrass created a living ocean that rippled and swayed in the constant prairie wind. This wasn't empty land, though. Far from it. Human beings have called Iowa home for at least 13,000 years. The earliest inhabitants were Paleo-Indian hunters who followed mammoth and giant bison across the post-glacial landscape. As the climate warmed and megafauna disappeared, these peoples adapted, developing increasingly sophisticated ways of living on the prairie. By around 500 BCE, the woodland cultures had emerged, leaving behind one of Iowa's most mysterious legacies, the effigy mounds. These earthen structures, shaped like bears, birds, and other animals, still dot the Iowa landscape, particularly along the Mississippi River bluffs. The people who built them invested enormous labor in these constructions, though their exact purpose remains debated by archaeologists to this day. When Europeans first arrived in the region, they encountered several distinct Native American nations. The Iowa people from whom the state takes its name were a Siouan-speaking nation who had migrated to the area centuries earlier. The name Iowa likely derives from a word meaning sleepy ones or dusty noses, though the exact etymology remains uncertain. The Iowa were joined by other nations, including the Meskwaki, often called the Fox by Europeans, and the Sauk. These peoples had developed sophisticated societies adapted to the prairie environment. They practiced a mixed economy of agriculture, hunting, and gathering. Women cultivated corn, beans, and squash in river bottom fields, while men hunted deer, elk, and the massive bison herds that still roamed the western prairies. These nations weren't isolated. They participated in vast trade networks that stretched across the continent. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains all found their way to Iowa through these networks. The rivers that bordered and crossed Iowa served as highways for canoes carrying goods and ideas across hundreds of miles. But by the early 19th century, this world was about to change forever. The first Europeans to lay eyes on Iowa were French explorers Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, who paddled down the Mississippi River in 1673. They were searching for a water route to the Pacific Ocean. They wouldn't find it, but they would document a land of remarkable abundance. Marquette wrote of prairies covered in grass so tall it could hide a man on horseback, of rivers teeming with fish, and of native peoples who greeted them with cautious hospitality. But France's interest in Iowa was primarily commercial. They wanted furs, not farms. For the next century and a half, Iowa remained on the periphery of European colonial ambitions. French traders established relationships with native nations, exchanging European goods for beaver pelts and other furs. The land itself was claimed by various European powers on maps drawn thousands of miles away. But on the ground, Native Americans remained the dominant presence. Everything changed in 1803 when President Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase, buying roughly 828,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon's France for approximately $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. Overnight, the land that would become Iowa passed from French to American control, though native peoples continued to live there as they had for generations. The following year, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led their famous expedition up the Missouri River, passing along Iowa's western border. They documented the land, the wildlife, and the native peoples they encountered. Near present-day Sioux City, they buried Sergeant Charles Floyd, the only member of the expedition to die during the journey. His grave still stands as one of Iowa's oldest historic sites, but it was another expedition that would have a more direct impact on Iowa's future. In 1805, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike led an expedition up the Mississippi River, documenting the eastern edge of what would become Iowa. Pike was impressed by the land's potential, writing that the soil appeared excellent for farming. His reports, along with those of other explorers, began to shape American perceptions of this distant prairie. The early 19th century brought increasing pressure on Iowa's Native American inhabitants. As American settlers pushed westward, the federal government pursued a policy of acquiring native lands through treaties agreements that were often negotiated under duress, and that native leaders had limited power to refuse. In 1832, the Black Hawk War erupted when the Sauk leader Black Hawk led a band of followers back across the Mississippi into Illinois, seeking to reclaim lands that had been taken through earlier treaties. The conflict was brief but brutal, ending with Black Hawk's defeat and the deaths of hundreds of native people. The consequences for Iowa were immediate. In the aftermath of the war, the federal government negotiated the Black Hawk Purchase, acquiring approximately 6 million acres along the Mississippi River. For the first time, American settlers could legally enter what would become Iowa. Over the following decades, additional treaties progressively stripped Iowa's native nations of their remaining lands. The Meskwaki ceded lands in 1842, the Potawatomi in 1846. By 1851, when the last major land cession occurred, Iowa's original inhabitants had been largely removed to reservations in Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. It's essential to acknowledge what this process meant. For Native Americans, these treaties represented the loss of homelands their ancestors had occupied for centuries. Entire ways of life were destroyed. Communities were torn apart. The trauma of removal echoes through Native communities to this day. There is one remarkable exception to this story of removal. In the 1852, a group of Meskwaki used their own money to purchase land in Tama County, Iowa. Rather than accept removal to a distant reservation, they chose to stay in their homeland. The Meskwaki settlement remains today, a testament to one community's determination to maintain their connection to Iowa's land. As native lands were opened to settlement, a flood of pioneers began pouring into Iowa. They came by steamboat up the Mississippi, by wagon across the prairies of Illinois, and later by railroad from the east. The population growth was explosive. In 1840, Iowa's non-native population stood at roughly 43,000. By 1860, it had grown to over 675,000, a 15-fold increase in just 20 years. Who were these pioneers? They came from everywhere. Many were native-born Americans from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, seeking cheaper land. As those states filled up, they brought with them the agricultural knowledge of the Ohio River Valley, techniques that would prove well-suited to Iowa's similar climate and terrain. The 1,840 and 1,850 saw massive waves of European immigration to America, and Iowa received more than its share. Germans fled political upheaval and economic hardship following the failed revolutions of 1848. Irish families escaped the devastating potato famine that killed over 1 million people. Scandinavians from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark sought opportunity in a land they'd heard had fertile soil and room to grow. These immigrant groups often settled in clusters, creating communities where they could maintain their languages, religions, and cultural traditions. The Amana colonies, founded by German Pietists in 1855, still stand as one of the most remarkable examples of communal living in American history. Dutch settlers founded Pella in 1847, creating a community that still celebrates its heritage with annual tulip festivals. Norwegian and Swedish settlers concentrated in northeastern Iowa, building Lutheran churches that served as anchors for their communities. By the time Iowa achieved statehood in 1846, it had become one of the fastest-growing places in America. The 1850 census recorded people born in virtually every state and dozens of foreign countries. This diversity would shape Iowa's character in lasting ways, creating a culture that blended Yankee practicality with European traditions and frontier adaptability. For all the romance we attach to pioneer life today, the reality was brutally hard work, and nowhere was this more evident than in the fundamental challenge facing every Iowa settler: breaking the prairie. The tallgrass prairie that covered Iowa was beautiful, but it was also formidable. Thousands of years of grass growth had created a dense mat of roots, sometimes extending 6 feet or more into the soil. This root mass, called prairie sod, was so tough that ordinary plows simply bounced off it. The solution came from an Illinois blacksmith named John Deere. In 1837, Deere developed a steel plow with a specially shaped moldboard that could slice through prairie sod where cast iron plows had failed. The steel was smooth enough that the sticky prairie soil wouldn't cling to it, and strong enough to cut through the toughest roots. Deere's invention would revolutionize prairie farming and eventually grow into the John Deere Company that remains headquartered in Illinois to this day. Even with improved plows, breaking prairie was exhausting work. Farmers typically used teams of 6 to 8 oxen to pull the heavy breaking plows through virgin sod. A good team might break 2 to 3 acres per day, meaning that a farmer starting with a 160-acre homestead faced months of grueling labor before a single crop could be planted. Building shelter presented another challenge. Iowa's prairies had few trees, and those that existed were concentrated along river bottoms. Early settlers often built their first homes from the very sod they were trying to break, cutting blocks of dense prairie turf and stacking them like bricks to create sod houses or soddies. These structures were cool in summer and warm in winter, but they were also dark, prone to leaking, and occasionally hosted uninvited wildlife. Snakes dropping from sod roofs became a common pioneer complaint, but the reward for all this labor was remarkable. Once broken, Iowa's prairie soil proved extraordinarily fertile. The same root systems that made the sod so difficult to break had been enriching the soil with organic matter for millennia. Early farmers reported yields that seemed almost miraculous compared to the worn-out soils of the East. Corn, wheat, oats, and hay all thrived in Iowa's deep black earth. The 1,850 seconds brought a development that would transform Iowa from a remote frontier into a connected part of the national economy. The railroad. Before the railroad, Iowa farmers faced a fundamental problem. They could grow crops in abundance, but getting those crops to market was expensive and difficult. Wagon transport over rutted prairie roads was slow and costly. River transport worked for farmers near the Mississippi or Missouri, but much of Iowa was far from navigable water. The first railroad reached Iowa in 1855, when a line from Chicago extended to Rock Island, Illinois, on the Mississippi River. The following year, the first railroad bridge across the Mississippi opened, connecting Rock Island to Davenport, Iowa. Suddenly, Iowa farmers had a direct link to eastern markets. Railroad construction across Iowa proceeded at a remarkable pace. Multiple companies raced to lay track across the state, each seeking to capture the profitable freight and passenger traffic. The federal government encouraged this expansion through generous land grants, giving railroad companies alternating sections of land along their routes. The companies could then sell this land to settlers who would become customers for railroad shipping. The railroads didn't just connect existing towns, they created new ones. Railroad companies platted towns along their routes at regular intervals, selling lots to businesses and settlers. The towns that got railroad service thrived. Those that were bypassed often withered away. This pattern explains why so many Iowa towns are spaced roughly 10 to 15 miles apart, about the distance a farmer could travel by wagon to ship his grain and return home in a day. In 1867, the first transcontinental railroad was completed at Promontory Summit, Utah. While Iowa wasn't on the main transcontinental route, it benefited enormously from the railroad boom this achievement sparked. By 1870, Iowa had over 2,000 miles of railroad track. By 1880, that number had grown to over 5,000 miles. The state had become a crucial link in the national transportation network, with Chicago to the east and the West Coast beyond. The decades following the Civil War marked Iowa's transformation into the agricultural powerhouse it remains today. With railroad connections to national markets, improved farming technology, and seemingly limitless fertile land, Iowa farmers created an agricultural empire. Corn became king. Iowa's climate and soil were ideally suited to corn production, and the crop proved endlessly versatile. It could be eaten directly, fed to livestock, or processed into countless products. By the 1872, Iowa had become the nation's leading corn producer, a position it has maintained with few interruptions ever since. But Iowa farmers quickly discovered that shipping raw corn wasn't always the most profitable approach. It made more economic sense to feed that corn to livestock and ship the animals instead. This realization gave rise to Iowa's other great agricultural tradition, livestock production, particularly hogs. The logic was simple but powerful. Corn was bulky and relatively cheap. Hogs were compact and valuable. A farmer who fed his corn to hogs was essentially concentrating the value of his grain into a more easily shipped form. The phrase, "hogs were the mortgage lifters," became common in Iowa, reflecting the crucial role pork production played in farm finances. The late 19th century brought wave after wave of agricultural innovation. Horse-drawn reapers, binders, and threshers replaced hand labor, allowing farmers to cultivate far more land than previous generations could have imagined. Steam-powered equipment appeared for the heaviest tasks. Farmers who had started with 80 or 160 acres began expanding their operations to 400, 800, or even more acres. This was the golden age of Iowa farm life that would later be romanticized in countless books and films. Prosperous farmsteads with substantial houses and large barns dotted the landscape. Rural communities revolved around churches, schools, and the rhythms of agricultural seasons. Farm families worked hard, but many achieved a level of comfort and security that their pioneer grandparents could scarcely have imagined. Iowa's growth continued into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fed by continuing waves of immigration. While the frontier era had drawn settlers from Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia, later decades brought new groups to Iowa's farms and towns. Czech and Bohemian immigrants established communities in eastern Iowa, bringing with them distinctive traditions of music, food, and community organization. Towns like Cedar Rapids developed thriving Czech neighborhoods where Old World customs blended with American opportunities. In southern Iowa, Italian immigrants came to work the coal mines that had developed in the region. Communities like Melcher, Dallas retained strong Italian heritage for generations. Their annual celebrations, featuring foods and traditions brought from the old country. Dutch immigrants, many from the Netherlands' northern provinces, established farming communities in northwest Iowa. Towns like Orange City and Sioux Center became centers of Dutch Reformed culture, with windmills, tulip gardens, and wooden shoe traditions that continue to attract tourists today. These immigrant communities didn't just preserve old traditions, they created new ones. Mutual aid societies helped newcomers find jobs and housing. Ethnic churches provided spiritual homes and social centers. Foreign language newspapers kept communities connected to their heritage while also helping immigrants navigate their new country. The Iowa that emerged from this period was remarkably diverse, yet also remarkably cohesive. People of different origins lived side by side, intermarried, and gradually created a shared identity as Iowans. The state developed a distinctive culture that valued hard work, education, practicality, and community traits that observers still associate with the Midwest today. Iowa's agricultural prosperity, however, was never guaranteed. The state's history is also marked by periods of profound struggle that tested the resilience of its people. World War I brought a brief boom to Iowa agriculture. European battlefields devastated that continent's farming regions, and American farmers rushed to fill the gap. "Food will win the war" became a national slogan, and Iowa farmers expanded production dramatically. Land prices soared as farmers borrowed to buy more acres and newer equipment. Then came the crash. When European agriculture recovered after the war, demand for American farm products plummeted, prices collapsed. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand suddenly found themselves unable to make their loan payments. The agricultural depression of the 1920s hit Iowa a full decade before the stock market crash brought hard times to the rest of the nation. The 1930s made things even worse. The Great Depression crushed what remained of farm prices. Drought and dust storms, while worst in states to the west, also affected Iowa. Farm foreclosures accelerated. In some counties, angry farmers organized penny auctions, buying up foreclosed equipment for pennies and returning it to the original owners, intimidating outside bidders who might have paid market prices. The federal government's New Deal programs brought some relief. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce production, hoping to raise prices by limiting supply. The Soil Conservation Service taught farmers new techniques to prevent erosion. The Rural Electrification Administration brought power lines to farms that had never had electricity. World War II finally ended the Depression and restored agricultural prosperity. Once again, Iowa farmers were called upon to feed the nation and its allies. This time, the post-war adjustment would prove smoother, as continuing demand and improved farm programs prevented a repeat of the 1920s collapse. The decades after World War II transformed Iowa agriculture in ways that would have astonished earlier generations. The pace of change was breathtaking, reshaping not just how farming was done, but the very fabric of rural society. Scientific advances revolutionized crop production. Hybrid corn varieties, developed through systematic breeding programs, dramatically increased yields. Iowa State University in Ames became one of the world's leading agricultural research institutions, developing new crop varieties, farming techniques, and livestock breeds. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides, controversial though they would later become, allowed farmers to push production to levels previously unimaginable. Mechanization accelerated at a stunning pace. By the 1952, tractors had largely replaced horses on Iowa farms. Combines that could harvest corn or soybeans in a single pass eliminated the need for large harvest crews. Farming became increasingly capital-intensive, requiring expensive equipment but far less labor. The human consequences of this transformation were profound. As machines replaced workers, farm families needed fewer hands. Young people who might once have stayed on the farm increasingly moved to cities for education and employment. Rural populations declined. Small towns that had thrived, serving farm families, found their customer base shrinking. Schools consolidated, churches closed, main streets that had once bustled with Saturday shoppers grew quiet. Farm operations themselves grew dramatically larger. In 1950, the average Iowa farm was about 170 acres. By 2000, it had grown to over 350 acres, and many operations were far larger still. Family farms didn't disappear, but they transformed, becoming sophisticated businesses requiring substantial capital and management expertise. This intensive agriculture also raised environmental concerns. Chemical runoff from farm fields contaminated waterways. The nitrates that helped crops grow also contributed to algal blooms and dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. Soil erosion, though reduced from Dust Bowl days, remained a concern. Balancing agricultural productivity with environmental stewardship became an ongoing challenge that Iowans continue to grapple with today. Through all these changes, Iowa developed a rich cultural identity that has influenced American life far beyond the state's borders. Perhaps no image captures the popular conception of Iowa better than Grant Wood's 1930 painting American Gothic, depicting a stern-faced farmer and his daughter before a Gothic revival farmhouse. The painting has become one of the most recognized and most parodied images in American art. Wood, an Iowa native who spent most of his life in Cedar Rapids, painted Iowa's rolling landscapes with a distinctive style that celebrated rural Midwestern life. Meredith Willson, born in Mason City, immortalized small-town Iowa in his beloved musical, The Music Man, River City. The fictional setting for the show was based on Wilson's memories of his hometown. The show's celebration of community, its gentle satire of small-town pretensions, and its ultimate affirmation of heartland values resonated with audiences who recognized something essential about American life in its portrayal. The University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop, founded in 1936, became the most prestigious creative writing program in the United States, training generations of American authors. Writers as diverse as Flannery O'Connor, John Irving, and Marilyn Robinson developed their craft in Iowa City, and the program helped establish Iowa as an unlikely center of American literary culture. Iowa's political influence also grew to outsized proportions. Since 1972, Iowa's first in the nation presidential caucuses have given this relatively small state an enormous role in selecting presidential candidates. Every 4 years, the nation's attention turns to Iowa as candidates crisscross the state, attending countless town halls, visiting farms, and seeking to connect with voters who have become famously discerning judges of political character. Today's Iowa is both a continuation of its pioneer heritage and something entirely new. Iowa's economy has diversified far beyond agriculture. Des Moines has become a major insurance and financial services center. Technology companies have established operations in Iowa's cities and towns. Renewable energy, particularly wind power, has become a significant industry. Iowa now generates more of its electricity from wind than any other state. Agriculture remains central to Iowa's identity and economy, but it looks very different from a century ago. GPS-guided tractors plant seeds with inch-perfect precision. Drones and satellites monitor crop health. Data analytics help farmers optimize every aspect of their operations. Iowa still leads the nation in corn and hog production, but today's farms are high-tech enterprises that bear little resemblance to the family operations of earlier generations. Iowa's population is also changing. While the state remains less diverse than the nation as a whole, recent decades have brought new immigrant communities from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Towns like Postville, Storm Lake, and Marshalltown have seen significant demographic shifts as immigrants have come to work in meatpacking plants and other industries. These newcomers are writing the latest chapter in Iowa's long history of immigration. Challenges remain. Many rural communities continue to lose population as young people leave for opportunities elsewhere. Small towns struggle to maintain schools, healthcare facilities, and basic services. The agricultural economy remains vulnerable to trade disruptions, weather extremes, and market volatility. Climate change poses uncertain but potentially significant threats to the farming systems that Iowa has developed over the past century and a half. So what does it mean that Iowa became America's heartland? In part, It's a geographic description. Iowa sits near the center of the continental United States, roughly equidistant from the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. It occupies a middle ground, not quite the rugged West, not quite the settled East, but something in between. But the term Heartland suggests something more than geography. It implies that the values and way of life developed in places like Iowa represent something essential about American character. Hard work, practicality, community, a belief that ordinary people, given opportunity and freedom, can build extraordinary things. The pioneers who broke the prairie and built farms from the raw earth passed down these values to their children and grandchildren. Immigrants who came seeking opportunity found it, and in the process, added their own traditions to Iowa's cultural mix. Each generation has faced its own challenges: economic depressions, wars, technological disruptions, social changes, and each has found ways to adapt and endure. Today, Iowa faces new challenges: climate change, technological disruption, demographic shifts, and global economic forces are reshaping the state in ways that are difficult to predict. The family farm that symbolized Iowa for generations is increasingly rare, replaced by larger operations that bear little resemblance to the diversified farms of the past. Yet there are also signs of renewal. Young farmers are experimenting with sustainable practices and direct-to-consumer sales. Small towns are finding creative ways to attract residents and businesses. Iowa's educational institutions continue to produce innovations that benefit agriculture and beyond. The resilience that enabled pioneers to transform prairie into farmland continues to shape Iowa's response to contemporary challenges. The story of how Iowa became America's heartland is not just history, it's an ongoing process shaped by each new generation of Iowans. The prairie that the pioneers found is mostly gone now, converted to cropland or covered by towns and cities. But the spirit that drove those pioneers, the belief that hard work and determination could create something lasting from raw possibility, that spirit endures. In the end, that might be what Heartland really means. Not just a place, but an idea, the belief that in the ordinary soil of everyday life, extraordinary things can grow. From the native peoples who first called this land home, to the pioneers who transformed it, to the farmers and city dwellers who sustain it today, Iowa's story is a testament to human determination and the enduring dream of building a good life in a good place. The prairie is gone, but its spirit remains, stretching endlessly beneath that impossibly wide sky.